I was one of the very lucky kids who was not torn away from my parents. I was always with somebody I knew loved me and would take care of me. I was never alone. And that was very unusual because most kids were torn away from their parents. And I can't imagine even the fright they must have gone through. And they were all put to their deaths because Germans had certainly no use for budding new generations of Jews. And then one day, a couple of Nazi officers walked into the building. Excuse me. I got it.
Call from Greenwood L. Call from Green.
I am on a Zoom. I'll call you back. Excuse me, I'm sorry, I cannot turn it off. So anyhow, a troop of Nazis marched into the building and a gunshot rang out into the air and they ordered all men, working age men like 18 through 45, to line up downstairs. And well, Budapest winters are similar to Midwestern winters here. They're cold and snowy. And now it's November. And my daddy had his beautiful custom-made coat on and his boots and his little knapsack. And you know, the Germans told a lot of lies. But the one that stands out in this case to me was that they're taking these people to work and they bring them back. And of course, that was not their intention. Their intention was to deport them. But at least that kept the rest of the building calm. They really headed down the deportations path because they had cleared most of Eastern Europe by that time, and Hungary was the last country to be occupied by the Germans. The Hungarian Nazi Party was also very strong, and many Hungarians welcomed the Germans with open arms. So we were fighting against the German Nazis and against the Hungarian Nazis. And I don't mean physically fighting because nobody fought that. Now my daddy's gone and a few days go by and the same scenario takes place, and this time they take my mother. And there she stood in front of me in her beautiful Persian lamb coat and boots and a little knapsack. And she tried her darnest to put a smile on her face. I mean, you must not scare the child, right? So, and she said to me, darling, I love you. Please be a good girl and listen to grandma, and I'll see you soon. Same thing your mom would say to you if she went away for a weekend and left you with grandma. Except in this case, that's the last time I ever saw my mom. I was only 11 years old. Well, so I still had grandma. I still was not alone. And there's a knock at the door. Everybody freezes when there's a knock at the door because it's probably the Nazis, and what do they want now? But to our surprise, it was my daddy. And he told the story of having been in a cattle car. And if any of you have ever been to the Illinois Holocaust Museum, the museum is actually built around the cattle car, so you could see how people were being squeezed together in a cattle car and deported. Anyhow, he was on one of those cattle cars when a couple of Nazi officers wanted directions to Budapest. That was my daddy's lucky day because he spoke a fluent German. And so he became their guide to Budapest. And when they got back, they let him go. And as soon as he walked in, he looked for Mom. And Grandma and I told him the story and immediately said, I am going after her. I'm going after her. I know where they're collecting the people. They're collecting them at the brickyard. Well, as it turns out, they virtually always collected people at a brickyard because they were situated on the railroad and that facilitated deportations. And I, as a little girl, tugged at him and said, Daddy, please don't leave me. Please don't go. And even my grandmother, my mother's mother, said to him, there's nothing you can do for her. And you will be lost to us too if we go. So with that, my dad did not go. And then once again, there's a knock at the door. And this time it's Julia. We had a wonderful live-in housekeeper because my mom worked with my dad at the store. And Julia had been with us, well, ever since I could remember. So Julia was another mommy to me. And she must have loved me dearly to risk her life to save mine. She was a wonderful Catholic lady who took her life in her hands, and truly had somebody found out that she was harboring a Jewish child, that would have been the end of her and the end of me. And my grandmother threw some articles of clothing in a brown paper bag, and we took off the yellow star and we set off for her house. And on the streetcar, she told me that we're going to tell the neighbors that my parents live in Eastern Hungary, where the Russians were already occupying the country. And they sent me to my Aunt Julia to get me away from the Russian occupation. She also told me that her neighbor, Teresa, was a big Nazi sympathizer, and I had to be very careful what I said. And she taught me the rosary, because that I did not learn in Catholic school. And she felt an 11-year-old child, if she's being questioned, she should know. So now my Catholic school education comes in handy, just in case somebody questions me. Nobody did, but it was there. And well, Julia and I slept in this big bed, and she put her arm around me, and I felt very, very safe with her. Once again, food-wise, we didn't have what we wanted to eat, but she had beans and potatoes and smoked meats, and she would bake bread, and we were not starving. And life went on like that until one day it started absolutely raining bombs from the sky, night and day and day and night. Now we're in a 5-story apartment building, and everybody heads for the basement. And there's a big stack of chopped wood down there, probably for firewood. And we take blankets and pillows with us, and we make beds next to each other on top of the chopped wood. You can imagine how uncomfortable that must have been. The basement was not meant to be lived in. There was no electricity down there. We lived by candlelight. It was winter time. It was cold. It was dark. It was damp. It was miserable. But the worst part was, well, you have a bunch of people and there are no toilet facilities. And so a bucket is available where you could do your business. And then during the night, the waste is thrown out and the place becomes very stinky in a hurry. And you either learn to live with that or you go out and let a bomb hit you. And that's not a very big decision to have to make. And we lived like that for a couple of months. In between bombings, Julia would run upstairs and grab some food and bring it down. And she'd tell me all kinds of stories about my family and when I was little to try to keep me amused. So she picked me up towards the end of November, and now we're in January. And by this time, well, the building has shook and trembled so many times. We were so sure that one of the bombs was going to kill us that the question really became, it wasn't a question of survival. It was, well, what's going to kill us first, the bombs or the Nazis? But came the middle of January and the bombing slowed down and eventually stopped, and even the machine gun fire abated. And word started traveling from building to building that there was guerrilla warfare in the streets, and the Russians were occupying Budapest, thereby fleeing the Jews. We waited a while, made sure that everything was quiet, and then finally we had enough nerve to open the basement door. Now it's January and there's snow on the ground, and of course the sun is reflecting off the snow. So you can imagine how bright it was. And after having been in a dark basement, you couldn't see a thing. But as soon as the door opened and I could go out, I could smell. And that smell will forever linger with me. And the only way to explain that smell, it was the smell of death. There were dead bodies all over the streets. There were dead horses all over the streets. People were so hungry, they were running out with a carving knife to carve up the dead horses for a meal. But the war was over and we were alive. And that's much more than we had hoped for. So one of Julia's staircases was bombed out, the other one was intact. We managed to go upstairs. And the question now becomes, who might be alive from the family? You know, today you all have a cell phone on you. Imagine a world not only without cell phones, but those days in Europe, in Hungary, many homes didn't even have a home phone. And that was the case with Julia. And had she had a phone, the lines were all bombed out. So there was no way of communication. All we could do is sit and wait and see who might show up. Everybody who was in that basement was full of lice. But we all got rid of it. Julia, I think, had some kerosene. I don't know how she got. I remember her combing my hair over and over with a fine tooth comb. And, you know, that was, after the life and death situation we had just survived, that was truly a very, very small problem. So one day I was playing in front of her apartment and I look up and there's my golly, my daddy walking up towards me, and I flew into his arms. And my daddy by nature was a tall, good-looking man, walked very erectly, and now he was bent over and his complexion was all off and he was dragging, but I was in my daddy's arms. And he came in and story unfolded that he survived in what they called a Swedish protected building. There was a Swedish diplomat, whereas there were several, but this is the one I know of personally because of my dad. His name was Raoul Wallenberg, and he had instructions to buy up as many apartment buildings as he can. And he declared to the Nazis that these people are that they have now become Swedish citizens, and hands off, and don't you dare come in my building. Well, sometimes it worked and sometimes it didn't, but my dad's case, that his building, the Nazis never came in. Of course, there was very little food, and to quote him, there wasn't enough room to stretch a leg. But he was alive and he survived, and we have no idea what happened to the rest of the family. Now, I have always wondered if Julia and my parents had made an agreement for her to come and get me, if she was paid for it. I have no idea. And you know what? It's totally immaterial. She risked her life to save mine. Without her, I would not be here talking to you today. So my daddy needed good nourishment, and passenger trains were not running, and he took me and the two of us got on a freight train, much like he was being deported on, and we got off in a village, and he knocked on a farmer's door, And he negotiated with the farmer. And once again, that farmer, I'm sure, would not have taken us in had he no money to pay for it. So the only way he could have had money, my thinking is that if Julia hid some money for him. Anyhow, they took us in, and that lady made a bowl of scrambled eggs that night. I have no idea how many eggs my dad and I ate, but we were absolutely wolfed it down because that was the best thing we had eaten for a long time. And you know, today you take eggs for granted, but I hadn't as much as seen an egg, God knows how long by that time. So the lady was a good cook, and on a farm there's healthy food available, and we stayed there 2 3 weeks until my dad started feeling better. And then after that, I honestly don't remember what kind of train we took back to Budapest, but we went back to our old apartment. And we found another family living in it. And you know, there were some horrible people and there were some decent people. And the people who moved into our apartment were decent people because they left all our belongings intact. Don't forget, we could only take what we could carry. So there's a lot of stuff we left behind. And for a brief time, my dad and I actually shared the apartment with them until they could find a place to live. Well, slowly, very slowly, life took on some normalcy. My dad got his business back, and I went back to the Jewish gymnasium. Most interestingly, none of us asked each other, how did you survive? We were very happy to see each other, and not everybody was there that I had gone to school with before, but those of us who were alive went back to school. And it had been such a trauma in our lives that none of us dared touch that subject. To me, looking back, it would seem the obvious thing would have been to say, how did you survive? Where are your parents? Do you have your parents? But none of us was ever said to each other. And by this time, trainloads of deputies kept returning from the various camps. And with every trainload, I look for my mom, and she's not coming. But I am convinced that my mom is coming home to me. One day, my dad came home from work and told me that he found out that a few days after Julia took me, the Budapest ghetto was formed. And all the people who were left in the Yellow Star buildings were forced to the ghetto, where sanitation was nil and food was very scarce and people were crowded in like sardines. And the war was really coming to an end. It was a matter of days before the Russians would take over Budapest at this point. But the Hungarian Nazi Party was adamant on killing as many Jews as possible. So they would take a group of people and they'd march them down in the wintertime to the icy Danube, and they'd wire them together, and with one bullet, they would all sink to the bottom of the river. So please don't tell me that about the blue Danube, because the Danube is very red, tainted with the blood shot into it by the Nazis. And today, I understand, I've never been back to Hungary, but to commemorate these events, there's a row of bronze shoes sculpted at the shores of the Danube. So I went back to school, of course. I kept going to school. And then one day my dad came home and he was crying. And he sat me down and he told me that a lady came into the store and she was at the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp with my mom. And that my mom died of so-called natural causes, which meant that they didn't kill her, directly that she probably had typhus and starvation in her arms on Friday, January the 13th, 1945. And I absolutely did not believe that my mommy was not coming home to me. My mommy loves me. And I walked the streets looking for her for quite a while. No, of course, as soon as my dad was able, he contacted the American relatives to bring them up to date on who was alive and who wasn't. And since our immigration process had started, we had all our papers. We were one of the first ones after the war out of the country. And in January 1947, my dad and I took a train to Berlin. Julia was at the train station and she saw us off. And it was a very difficult parting because she and I were very attached to each other. And she gave me a beautiful little ring as a memento, and that I cherish dearly. Anyhow, my dad and I got on the train and slept in a bombed out hotel in Berlin. Not any different than all the buildings in Hungary. No building was left unscathed by that time. And when we next day after we spent the night in the hotel, he and I got on a Pan Am propeller plane to fly across the Atlantic. Now we're going to a new land. And my daddy wanted me, his little girl, to feel very good about this new land. And I honestly don't think that he himself believed the stories he told me, but he did tell me that everybody is rich in America. And when your clothes get dirty, you just put them in the garbage and buy new. And the streets filled with milk and honey. But above all, my three cousins in America were all boys, and therefore, being the only girl, I'd be the princess. And that didn't quite work out that way, but it sure sounded good. So we got to New York, and my mother's younger sister, Betsy's husband, who was a CPA, came and met us in New York, and we came to Chicago in a Pullman car. And now I met my new family. Paul and Tom were the two boys. Paul was a year older than I was, and Tom 2 years younger. And my Aunt Betsy and Uncle Eugene. There was a day bed for my father in the dining room, and they had turned it then into a bedroom for me. Well, I was in a new country with a different language, with strange people who kept telling me they loved me, but I didn't believe them. I mean, these are not the people I grew up with. And then my other uncle and aunt, two physicians, came over to visit, and they heard my father coughing. And well, they sent him for a chest x-ray, and he was very quickly diagnosed with tuberculosis. So off to Winfield Sanitarium he went, which was more than an hour's drive those days from where we had lived. And his family took me every single Sunday so I could wave to him through the window. Meantime, I was enrolled in school. I should have been in the 8th grade, but because of the language problem, I was in the 3rd grade, and I had studied some English in Europe, but it was nothing like the spoken English, and I felt totally at a loss with the language. So because of that, they put me in the 3rd grade, and little kids speak a simple language, and they were each and every one was so proud to teach me a word here and there. And as I became better with my language skills, I kept getting promoted. And within a year, I got caught up and I graduated grammar school actually one semester after I would have had I been born here. And just about at the same time, my daddy was pronounced negative. And now my daddy is coming home to me and he's going to make a home for me. And by the way, the princess, well, because I was the only girl, I was the one who was asked to set the table and wash the dishes. Nobody asked anything of me. I didn't ask of my own children. So please don't think that I was abused. But this was a different world. And, all I kept thinking is that princesses don't wash dishes. And I couldn't say that because I wouldn't dare say anything um, to cross my family. One of my biggest losses in my life, every child is entitled to the unconditional love of her parents. And that's what I lost. Even though they told me they loved me, I didn't believe it. And if I said no to something, maybe they'll throw me out on the street. And I grew up with that insecurity. I also was very insecure. Uh, well, my heart had a big hole in it for all the people I loved and I had lost. And so I used food as a substitute, and I was getting heavier and heavier, and they put me on one diet after the other diet. Nothing worked because I ate when they weren't looking, and there were no counselors around like you have today. And nobody wanted to hear about the Holocaust. Don't talk about it. Look forward and assimilate, and forget what happened. Well, boys and girls, you can't always forget what happened. And if you have a problem in your life, please don't hesitate to seek help because there's no shame in seeking help. And I found out many, many years later how well therapy can work. Okay, back to my story. Um, the boys, we were all growing up. My girlfriends were dating. I had no boyfriends. I was too fat, and they told me if I get too fat, nobody's going to love me. And that was a very, very big mistake on this family's part because I had no self-esteem anyhow. So that was about the last thing I needed. And my cousins were going to college, and I wanted to go to college too. My mom wanted me to be a doctor. I was all set to go to college, but nobody ever considered that the little immigrant girl might want to go to college. Nobody ever asked me. And my uncle wanted me to go to work in an office and then insisted I took some commercial courses in high school, which I was never good at the time because I wasn't interested. So I went to my school counselor and I told her that I would like to go to college, and she gave me some very bad advice. She said, just finish high school and worry about that later. Well, I kind of figured it out for myself that if I couldn't be a doctor, I could become a nurse and live at home. I mean, not live at home, but live at school and learn something. And I applied, and I not only got accepted at Mount Sinai Nursing School, but I even got a scholarship. And then all of a sudden, my life took another turn. A friend of mine said, Agnes, would you like to go on a blind date? And that's when I met Danny. And by golly, there was a boy who liked me. He liked me so much that he kept calling me, and he came over more and more often. And within a very short time, he told me he loved me. And then within 6 weeks, he asked me to marry him. Danny was 4 years older than I was. He was a recent DeVry graduate, which is a technical school. And TV repair people were very much in need because television was in its infancy in the United States, and everybody had a burned out tube here and there. Anyhow, he asked me to marry him, and I went to school next day, and I told my friend, and she said, what did you say? And I said, well, I guess I said yes. And then I became the belle of the ball at Sun High School My friends were going to college. I was getting married. Well, boys and girls, please don't do that. Make sure you learn something that you can make a living with, because you never know when life will call on you to support yourself and perhaps a family. I think today's young people are smarter than that. But the fact was that I was very unhappy at home, and so was Danny, and two unhappy young people found each other. And for my 18th birthday, I got a tiny little diamond ring, and the following October, I became Mrs. Daniel Kate. I was never happier in the United States than I was. Finally, I was happy. The marriage brought us three children. It had its problems, not at the beginning, but after 13 years of marriage, then he started telling some weird stories. Anyhow, he was diagnosed as a paranoid schizophrenic, and the doctor told me that sometimes it's an acute disease and sometimes it becomes chronic, and then it became chronic. And the typical thing for a paranoid schizophrenic is that they won't take the medication. He was in the hospital for 6 weeks and then was discharged. And I remember my children standing in the picture window and couldn't wait for their daddy. And he bounced in and out of the hospital. And the doctor at that time did a wonderful thing for me. She said, please call the Jewish Federation and make arrangements for counseling, because you're going to need some supportive therapy to get you through this. And that was the best advice anybody could have given me. And that's when my life truly started to unravel. And I started putting pieces together of why I did things the way I did. But I had my three children, and now it was becoming more and more evident that I would have to go to work. And the Jewish Federation, well, they wanted to send me to college. And I said, oh my God, now somebody wants to send me to college. I don't have 4 years. I have to put a roof over my kid's head. And I have to put food on the table. So we agreed, and they paid for it. And that's the only money I've ever accepted from anybody for support. I went to business college for a year. I became a very good stenographer. And now, yes, I did learn to type now because I had to. And my first job was with Wilson and Company, the meat packers and the sporting goods people. And I knew I had to make a better living. After 15 years, after having committed Danny several times in and out of the hospitals, I finally got a divorce because there was such an upheaval in the home that I couldn't raise three children with that. And I got a little experience at Wilson. And then I started to check into how I could make a better living. And I heard that secretaries in law offices have the highest pay scale. So I decided that that's where I will look. And first interview I went on, Brody and Gore. Mr. Gore interviewed me, and within a matter of a few minutes and the handshake, I was hired with $10 a week more than I was getting at Wilson and Company. And that was the beginning of a career in the law office. I knew absolutely nothing about pleadings. It was a whole new vocabulary. Maybe some of you have a mom or a dad who's an attorney and you know some of these terms, but I didn't know what a motion was or a brief was or an order was. But I learned very quickly, and I loved every minute of it. I absolutely soaked it up. And would I have had my 4 years of college before? I am sure that I would have gone on to law school and become an attorney, but I didn't have the basics. So as it works out, after a few years, I was with them for 9 years, and the office manager retired and I was promoted, so I was making a better living. And then the two partners, one after the other, died of cancer, and I couldn't get along with the junior partner, they called him at the time. So I knew I had to find another job. And I bounced around from a couple different offices, couple years here and a couple years there, until I got to my last job where I was for 17 years. Now, I raised my three children alone. I worked very hard. I worked many times 6 days a week, and I took my youngest one with me on a Saturday, and I worked a half a day. Everybody always had shoes, and there was always food on the table. And their friends, anybody who wanted to stay for dinner, they were always welcome. My kids remember my house that you never knew who was going to turn up at mom's table. And that's the way I wanted it, because the family I lived with did not want me to invite people for dinner. And I was embarrassed because they invited me and I couldn't reciprocate. So I made sure that I didn't do that with my kids. So my kids grew up, and two out of them, my middle child, I had a lot of problems with. He adored his father, and now his father was gone from the home. And actually, he was a high school dropout, and eventually he got his GED and even a few college courses later. But the other two graduated college. My oldest son went into the printing business. My daughter got married, and they moved to Florida. And they had three beautiful children. And I went and stayed with them for a while after each child was born. My middle child eventually got married and had one child. So now I have 4 grandchildren, and I am so proud of all 4 of them. They all have secondary degrees. They're all doing well, and they're living the kind of lives I would have liked for myself. But that's okay, because I truly enjoy seeing them flourish. And now, well, my mom didn't see me grow up after I was 11, and I have been lucky enough to see 4 generations, because my grandson in Florida gave me 2 little grandkids, and my other grandson in Denver gave me 2 little great grandkids. And now the baby of the family, my daughter's daughter, is expecting in August. And I hope I live long enough to cuddle that baby in my arms. And in essence, that's the story of my life. I have written my memoir, and I have asked Kale to please make sure that your school library gets a copy. That this goes into much more detail than I've had the time to tell you. I just want to leave you with a couple of messages that are very important. First of all, thank you, teachers, for teaching the Holocaust. Because as a survivor, it even seems unreal to me that people could have been so cruel to each other. Please go home and tell somebody that you, via Zoom, met a Holocaust survivor today, and don't ever let anybody deny it happened, because now you have met somebody. No, I did not live through a concentration camp. And there are many different stories. Each of us have our own story. But the common denominator is always tragedy. My life would have gone very differently if my mom and dad had immigrated long before, and the 2 sisters would have taken them under their wings. My dad went back and remarried, and he married a woman who had 2 children. The little girl just happened to have been my age. So you can imagine how I felt that my daddy didn't only desert me, but now he can hug another little girl. And all this played into my unhappy teen years, and it formed my life. My oldest son is now retired, and my middle child, who didn't want to go to school, he's very clever with his hands. He's chief engineer at one of the Hilton hotels. And my daughter is very good at sales, and she has had many jobs. Please appreciate your democracy. Don't take it for granted. It's worth fighting for, and you don't know how important it is. You know, next to food and water, it is the most important thing in your life. And I'd fight for it any day of the week because I have lived through tyranny and I know the difference. So please go out and vote when you turn 18. That's your duty. My duty is to tell my story so that you know what it was like. But your duty is to be tomorrow's citizens and go out and be sure that you cast a ballot. I don't care who it was for. That's up to you, and that's democracy. But it is incumbent upon you to do that. For 50 years, I didn't talk about the Holocaust. And then one of my grandchildren said, Grandma, we're studying the Holocaust. Would you come to my school and speak about it? And after a difficult sleepless night, I agreed. And that was my first outing as a speaker. And then I taught at his brother's 8th grade class and his sister's. And then I became involved with the Illinois Holocaust Museum, and then eventually with Omaha Week of Learning. And well, the Illinois Holocaust Museum is my home away from home. Unfortunately, the Speakers Bureau, because of our age, is dying out. And while I can talk, I will talk. My legs don't work so well, but my mouth and my brain work. So as long as I am able, I will tell my story so it can never, never, never happen again. Very, very important. So that's my legacy, that it never happens again. And you know what, Hitler, I fooled you because my family flourished after you killed most of them off.
Agnes, thank you so much.
You're
Thank
welcome.
you so much for that. I mean, there's really no other word but vulnerability, to lay it all out there for us, the trauma that comes from war and from hate, the intergenerational trauma that we know now, that visits families from all of this. We have just about 10 minutes left. If we have any questions, teachers, if you want to pop those in the chat, since we have so many on the call right now, that would be helpful. Agnes has been so great for us this year in telling this story. And as she said, every survivor has a different story. Everyone is different, but the common denominator is the tragedy, is the trauma, is the loss. And of course, when we hear and see them now looking so beautiful and so happy and so healthy, it is easy to say, well, there was a happy ending here. And while there is a happy ending in Agnes's story, it took a really long time to get there.
No, most people came to America to find gold. I came and found freedom, which is more precious than gold.
Ms. Sullivan's class asked if you're an American citizen, and if so, when did that happen?
I am. As soon as I married an American citizen, and I turned 18. Oh, that's very important to me. Oh, those are most important papers in my life. I've never gone back to Hungary. Hungary is a very anti-Semitic country and still is, and I think it always will be.
There's a big press for nationalism in Hungary again now, authoritarianism, and the anti-Semitism is rising in Hungary terribly. From Ms. Fosco's room, what happened to your husband?
What happened to my husband? Well, he roamed the country because he thought the IRS was after him. or the government. I mean, that was his paranoia, that was his sickness. And he was walking down a highway in Las Vegas area in the dark of night. And I don't know if he intended to commit suicide or he was just walking down and the truck didn't see him, but he was hit by a semi. And my mother-in-law called me at the office and told me, and she started out with I know you don't care. And I started to sob. And that's when I realized that 15 years after I got divorced, I still loved him. And I did get remarried after my kids were grown. And I was married for 20 years. And somehow mental illness has always followed me because my second husband had a son who touched their lives by mental illness. So I miss my second husband very much. It's the end of March. It will be 20 years that he's gone.
Well, mental illness is something that is getting more and more people are being willing to talk about this.
Yes. And
I
that's also, that would take another hour and a half for me to talk about that because that's my other soapbox. But people don't realize how mental illness affects the whole family instead of just a patient.
Well, and that's a great segue into this next question from Ms. Hendrickson's class. How do you think your children and grandchildren have been affected by your childhood experience?
Well, not my grandchildren, but my children. If I had to redo it, I would raise them very differently. First of all, we didn't celebrate any of the Jewish holidays because I was always afraid to be Jewish. And because of that, I cheated them out of some of their rich heritage. I'm not a religious woman, but there's such rich history to Judaism that I'm sorry they don't really know. My mother-in-law wanted to buy my daughter some religious jewelry, and I said, absolutely not. And I don't know if your class knows what a mezuzah is, but that's what Jewish people put on their doorposts. That's part of the Ten Commandments, I think. And I would never allow one of those on my doors because I never denied I was Jewish, but I always said it was nobody's business. And it took me a long time to get over that. I also finally met some survivors when I moved to Skokie many, many years ago, late in the 60s. And until then, I really didn't know any survivors. And that was a big relief to me to be able to talk to other survivors. And unfortunately, I lost several of them who were very good friends.
But just not being able to talk about your experience with anyone
Right.
or to share who you were with anyone for all of those years adds a whole nother layer.
Yes, yes.
I think.
Well, I don't think I have enough time to tell you the whole story, but anyhow, I met a lady who told me that there was an organization, a small organization of Hungarian survivors, and they met once a month, and she invited me to the first meeting. At first, I didn't want to have anything to do with it. And then the next time she invited me, I went, and that was one of the best things I could have done for myself. I had some dear, dear friends there.
Well, you have some dear, dear friends here in Omaha too, and we are so hopeful.
Too. You are all here too.
We are so hopeful that next year we will all be back in person and I can actually bring Agnes to your school where everybody is allowed to sit next to each other in an auditorium again, because there's nothing like the energy of people and hugs and in-person programming.
Absolutely. I miss that personal touch. I miss seeing you students on their faces, whether you understand what I'm saying or not. And it's much easier to read you in person.
We have one last question, which I think is important. About Julia. Since leaving Hungary, were you in touch with her?
I was in touch with her until she passed away. And by that time I was grown. My dad wrote that she passed away, and then I started working. I started writing to Yad Vashem, the museum in Israel, and I wanted her recognized as a righteous Christian. And finally, after 2 years of correspondence, they accepted it because all I had was my word. They kept asking for proof. And I was in Israel about 13 years ago, and I was at Yad Vashem, where they not only took my testimony, but I felt I was at Julia's grave. And I really let loose. The tears really came pouring. And I don't know if as a child, I sufficiently understood how she risked her life to save mine. So now I could thank her in person.
Well, that was a perfect way to end, because I know Ms. Sullivan's class knows about the righteous Gentiles. They enter our essay contest every year.
Yes, yes, and we at the Illinois Holocaust Museum have a whole exhibit outside with plaques for the righteous Gentiles, and God bless them. You know, the diplomat who saved my father's life, he saved at least 10,000 Jews.
Raoul Wallenberg.
Yes.
Worth looking up. Absolutely. Mount Michael and Fremont Middle School, thank you so much for tuning in today. Fremont, thank you for being flexible and being patient with me. And thank you, Agnes, again, for tuning in this morning with us. I hope you all, before the bell rings in 1 minute, I hope you all have a great rest of the week.
Bye, you all. I'd love to see you.
Say goodbye. Say goodbye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, teachers.
Oh, I hear life.
Or you can say thank you.
Thank you.
That was perfect.
Perfect. I'll see you tomorrow, okay?
All right, I'll see you tomorrow morning. Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.